Boker Tov, good morning. Good morning and welcome to another edition of Bible study class at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Hammond, Louisiana. We'd like to welcome those that are joining us via our YouTube channel. We welcome you in the name of the Lord. We're glad you found us and are able to join us and participate with us. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Reverend Louis Bolt. I'm the pastor here at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Hammond, and we're glad you could join us. We're in the midst of a Bible study called The Greatest Stories of the Bible, or the Bible's Greatest Stories. And last week, if you were able to join us, we covered two major events in the history of God's people, the Israelites, that dealt with the construction of the temple, the second temple. Remember that the temple was destroyed under Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, in 587 BC. And then they returned to Jerusalem. They were set free by Cyrus the Great in 538 BC. And they returned in waves, as we'll see over the course of time from last week and this week as well. So let's begin this week with a word of prayer. I'm going to read from Psalm 119, verses 189 to 176. And the psalmist writes, "Let my cry come before you, O Lord. Give me understanding according to your word. Let my plea come before you. Deliver me according to your word. My lips will pour forth praise, for you teach me your statutes. My tongue will sing of your word, for all your commandments are right. Let your hand be ready to help me, for I have chosen your precepts. I long for your salvation, O Lord, and your law is in my delight. Your law is my delight, rather. Let my soul live and praise you, and let your rules help me. I have gone astray like a lost sheep. Seek your servants, for I do not forget your commandments. In Jesus' name, amen." All right. So this week we're gonna go over to the board to my left, where we have a listing of kings, starting with Cyrus the Great. So you'll remember that the Medo-Persian army defeats the Babylonians, and now they're the major power broker, if you will, on the block in the ancient world. And Cyrus the Great began ruling in Persia, Medo-Persia, in 559 BC, and he rules until 530 BC. Now, he issues the decree, as I mentioned earlier, in 538 BC. So the decree was to allow any inhabitant of Jerusalem and the land of Yahweh to return home. He also equipped them with resources and funds to rebuild the temple. The first thing they did was rebuilt the altar in 537 BC. They offered sacrifices at the Festival of Booths. The next year they began construction on the temple. They laid the foundation, but then work ceased. Work ceases until, completely in 530 BC because of opposition. And then we have Cambyses II, Darius the Great, who's the son of Cyrus, and then Darius' son Xerxes takes the throne in 485 BC to 465, and the Hebrew name that he's referred to by is Ahasuerus. And we're gonna spend some time dealing with this time in history, and then our next event that we studied last week happened under the reign of Artaxerxes, and I had an error on my sheet. So if you wrote down 429 BC, please change that to 424. My penmanship is horrible, and sometimes I can't even read it. But nevertheless, Artaxerxes reigned over the Medo-Persian Empire from 464 to 424 BC. And Ezra, the scribe we encountered last week, he comes to Jerusalem in 458. Now, where was Ezra living? Well, Ezra was living in the land of Babylon. Right? So notice that even though the decree was issued in 538, not all the Israelites returned right away. They would come back in sort of fits and starts, if you will, spurts, to repatriate the land. And Ezra comes in 458 BC to read the word of the Lord to God's people. And then Nehemiah, who's serving as the cupbearer under Artaxerxes, goes to Jerusalem in 445 BC, and he rebuilds the walls, or it's under his supervision and efforts that they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in 445. And it took them, as we heard last week, 52 days to rebuild the walls and the gates. So now they have a question? Or they have a fortified city, and so they can be defended from their enemies. And now the shame that they were under was lifted. And then Nehemiah returned to Artaxerxes to continue serving in his court. All right, so this is the time frame that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks. And today's lesson is going to fall under this king's reign. And so why is it that Ezra spans a whole bunch of time in his writings and refers to different kings? I can't answer that question. Or in the book of Ezra, the author does. And then Nehemiah is what we studied last week. So if we were to go now to this board, to my right, we'd see our lesson for today. We're going to have a two-part story on this woman named Esther and the king. And the king in question, as we're going to find out as we get into the text, is Ahasuerus in Hebrew, or Xerxes in Greek. And so part one is going to deal with chapters 1 and 2, okay, of the book of Esther. Now, over here is some important historical events that happened in the life of God's people, the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You'll remember that there was a united kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon, and then that kingdom splits in 931. And then we study the fall of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of what's also called the kingdom of Israel, in 728 BC, and then the fall of the southern kingdom, which is also referred to as the kingdom of Judah, in 587 BC. And then we learn of the return from exile under the great decree of Cyrus in 538. And so this enables the people of God, the one true God, Yahweh, to return to Jerusalem and the Promised Land. And then, as we talked about that over there earlier. All right, so now let's come back to the center. It's always good to be in the center. And we're not talking politics, by the way. Just in the middle of the room. All right. Okay. All right. So Esther, chapters 1 and 2 today. All right, so we're going to start there. And if you haven't already gotten there in your Bible, you may do so. I'm not sure what page you're going to be on. Just depends on what Bible you're using. Now, the text says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the capital, in the third year of his reign, he gave a feast for all of his officers and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. All right, let's just stop there for a minute. So we learn a couple of things. We get the historical reference that this time frame is under the reign of Ahasuerus. He's the king, and he's often referred by his Greek name Xerxes as well. But here in the book of Esther, he's going to be referred to by the Hebrew name Ahasuerus. And he's going to throw a great feast. It lasts 180 days. That's 6 months. That's a big party, right? And it's not just for a couple of people. Right? It's for the governors of the 127 provinces that were under his name, his army, and all the great officers and officials of the kingdom. This is a celebration feast that happens in the third year of his reign. And so this is, if you will, this is even though it's in his third year, and so when do we have the inaugural balls for the President of the United States? Right after as he takes the oath of office, right? Right after he takes the oath of office, we have the balls. And now, how can that happen today? Well, you and I know, after November 7th, who the next president of the United States will be. Right after the election, we kind of know who that's going to be. It's going to be a while before he takes office. But there's time to plan these balls. Now, in the ancient world, when they didn't have cars. And notice that his kingdom, if we were to go to our map, India's somewhere off over here, right? And his kingdom goes from India all the way to Ethiopia in Africa. And so this is a huge kingdom, and it's going to take a while to get the word out, right, that they're going to have this feast. And it's going to take a while for everybody to get there. But notice the, so let's go back over here. Note the extravagance of the feast. So this is sort of an inaugural, if you will, ball. It's a celebration feast that he's now the king. He's taken over from his father Xerxes, as he's now the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, and he's going to throw an extravagant feast. This extravagance tells us a little something about King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes. That he likes to display his wealth and his generosity toward his officers. But it's not going to be just restricted to them. But let's not lose sight of the fact that this is a 6-month feast. When I was back at the map, I should have shown you on the map where this is. So Babylon is here, and Susa, the capital, he says he's in the capital of Susa, and Susa is due west of here. So there are a number of royal cities in the Medo-Persian Empire, and at this time the king is in Susa, so he winters there. He spends summers and winters in different places, but he's in the capital city of Susa at this time. All right, so 180 days, 6 months. Can you imagine having people at your house for 6 months? Some of us, a weekend is enough, right? It's time for them to go, right? But he holds a feast, and he invites all the important people, right? He invites the officers, officials, and his servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So notice then that who's the center of attention here in the end? King Ahasuerus, right? King Xerxes. Because look what I'm doing for all y'all, right? And so he's getting some props and some recognition more than likely. And he's basking in their gratitude. And when these days were completed, the 180 days, the 6 months of feast, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now, 6 months for all the important people, 1 week for the commoners. But notice that he does allow them into the garden of the king's palace. So for a week, he allows the common people, not just the important commoners, right, in the city of Susa, but even the marginalized people probably are allowed to go into the king's palace and to feast in the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desires. So Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So notice now, that back in the day, so many of you know we've got a wedding coming up, and there's oftentimes the tradition of tapping the wine glass or the champagne glass and for the bride and groom to kiss, right, and all that stuff. But back in the day, if you were at a party at the king's palace, you could not drink unless the king was drinking. Okay, so this compulsion that it talks about is they lifted that rule. So you could drink any time you wanted to have a drink at this party that lasts for a week. And you're drinking from the king's royal wine closet, as they say, the best of the best of wine. And for a week, they eat, drink, and be merry in the palace, in the garden of the palace of the king. And so he lifted the rule, and anything that anybody asked for, this would be like, I guess in our modern day parlance, maybe having Emeril Lagasse as your personal live-in chef, right? Where you could wake up at 2 in the morning and go get Emerald and ask him to make something for you, and he'd make it, right? That's probably not going to happen, but that's the way it was in the time. And notice that Queen Vashti, so if she's the queen, what does that mean? She's the wife of the king, right? She's the wife of the king, and she was giving a girls-only feast. So the one in the garden of the palace was for the men, great and small within the city of Susa. And then the queen was giving her own party, right? Got to keep the sexes separate, right? Men's parties and girls' parties and women's parties, I should say. And they did so. Now, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine. Now, you know what that means, right? Okay. He was drunk, right? The king was drunk. He was well lubricated, as they say. Right? On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Abiztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Let's just stop there for a minute. So a 6-month feast for all the officials, all the army, all those people. And now, and I'm sure the wine was flowing then too, right? And now at the end of a 7-week feast for the little people, as they would say, for the common people, he's now going to do what? He's going to show off his beautiful wife, right? He wants everybody to know sort of just how great she is and how pleasant she is to look at. And so he now, you know what a eunuch is, right? We all know what that is. I don't have to explain that. Right, good. And they became eunuchs, as we'll see later on, because they were going to be in charge of the king's harem, his concubines. And so they couldn't have enjoy themselves with the concubines. Let's just leave it that way. All right, and so he calls his 7 eunuchs. Evidently, he's got a big harem, and he tells them to go bring his wife. Now notice he doesn't go say, "Honey, come on. I'd like to show you off before the people." He sends his servants to go do this, to go bring her to him. But we learn in verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. So the queen hears the command. She receives the eunuchs. She knows what her husband wants her to do, but she does what? I ain't going. Right? She stays put. Now, we don't know why. The text doesn't tell us why, but it wouldn't take too much to imagine why she might be a little upset. You want me to you want to show me off to the common people? You want me to come before them so they can see what you have? I'm reading into the text there. But nevertheless, now what was the king's reaction? At this, the king became enraged, and his anger, his burned within him. So the king issued a decree to his lovely wife, his queen, and she said what? No. There may be even a Sheol in there, right? We don't know for sure. But you can imagine that. And the king was what? After 6 months and 1 week of drinking, right? We don't know what interactions they had during the 6 months. But after the week of drinking, where he's well lubricated, he becomes angry, right? His emotions get the better of him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, where this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Sathar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom. So that phrase, saw the king's face, it doesn't refer to at that very moment. These are his innermost circle of counselors, right? These are people who are well versed in the law of the land. Now remember Remember that the land of the Medo-Persian Empire extends all the way over here off our map and throughout this region here. And so these are these would be like regional, if you will, regional vice presidents, right? They're going to be over certain territories, but they also come before the king on a regular basis to speak with him and have counsel and give him counsel as he has need. So he calls them because they're the ones who are well versed in the law and the kingdom. And he asked them, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. So he's looking for guidance on how to handle his wife, right, from the 7 princes, the ones well versed in the law. Now, this would seem to be, if not that any of you would ever have a problem with your wife, or that I had a problem with my wife necessarily, right? But usually when there's a problem in our marriage, what do? We try to work it out together, right? So we try to resolve the situation. And sometimes we need outside counsel. So that's why we have something called marital counseling, right? For couples that are married who need a little assistance to work through a situation. So he asked his innermost circle of counselors, what should I do to my wife, right? Because she refused to perform the command that I gave her. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials. So now notice these officials could be just the other 7, the rest of the 7, or it could be a greater group of people. But here's what he says. Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Now, that's a pretty tall thing, right? What this man just said is that the actions of the queen was not just toward the king. It wasn't just toward these officers or officials, rather, perhaps the 7 princes or greater, but the entire kingdom. Right? The entire kingdom of the 127 provinces. This is what the offense that she has committed is against all of the people. Now you might be thinking to yourself, gee, that's a little extreme, right? Maybe. But he goes on. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus command Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not command Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. Now notice the large leap, right? This man is saying that because the queen snubbed her husband, the king, now all women are going to do what? Snub their husbands, right? There's going to be mass revolt in the kingdom, right? Because of what Queen Vashti did, right? His concern is that now, and it'll become clear as we continue on. I'm not making this stuff up. It's going to be that she's now an example of how you can treat your husband, and there will be mass chaos and confusion and rebellion within the land because of what Queen Vashti has done. Now, some of us might think that's a little extreme. I don't know. This very day. Now, it took a while, 3 years, right, to plan the party. Took 3 years to plan the party and then 6 months to celebrate. And this man then goes on to say, this very day, right, from this moment forward, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. Now notice this one little action of the queen saying, honey, I'm not coming. Now, we don't know what she said. She just didn't come, right? I'm paraphrasing and adding in there. I probably shouldn't do that, but nevertheless, to dramatize things. Honey, I'm not coming. And this man claims from that very moment, and the word is going to spread like wildfire throughout the 127 provinces, and now every woman in the kingdom, right, is going to turn her nose up at her husband in contempt, and there's going to be wrath over the things that the husband says to the wife. Now, what does this communicate? Well, what this communicates is that in the Medo-Persian Empire, and not just the Medo-Persian Empire, in the kingdom of God, right, in God's order of creation, He created Adam first, and created Eve second. Now, that was in sequential order, right? But He also put Adam in charge. Right? He holds Adam responsible for what happens in chapter 3. And so there's a created order in God's created order. So the husband is to be the head of the household, and his wife is... Now that doesn't mean a position of servitude or anything like that. What it means is he's the authority that God has put in place, and the wife is to be obedient. So in some sense, this official is just really upholding God's order of creation. Okay? But he goes so far as to say that from this very day, from this moment right now, every woman in the kingdom is now going to throw off the shackles of her husband, and she's going to treat her husband with contempt, and there's going to be wrath in plenty. If it please the king, this is Memucan who's still speaking. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. Now, we've heard of one of these decrees before, right? Back when we were studying in the book of Daniel, the decree that you could only pray to the king, right, for 30 days, and also the decree that you were supposed to bow down and worship the statue that was made, and that was a law that could never be repealed according to the law of the land. And so they're asking for another type of decree that way, that the Queen Vashti, could never, ever, ever again come in the presence of her husband. He called her to come, she refused, and now the punishment is going to be, if the king issues the decree, will be that she can never come into the presence of the king ever again. So, when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So the man's motivation was to what? To prevent the contempt and prevent the wrath that would happen as a result of Queen Vashti's actions. But now the king of the land, is going to clarify that because she did this, she can no longer come in the presence of himself, of the king. And now, because of that decree that is, all the women of the land will do what? Will respect and honor their husbands. Okay, that's the thinking. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So notice that the decree is written in the hand of the king himself. It's not by a scribe. He's writing with his own script. And notice that Xerxes then, or King Ahasuerus in Hebrew, is what? He's well learned in other languages. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to write in another language, but syntax and structure is different, right? So in our language, we tend to have the adjective where? Before the thing being described, right? So the noun comes after the adjective. In Hebrew, it comes before. The adjective comes after the thing being modified, right, or being described. So in Hebrew, when we say good morning, boker tov, it's actually boker tov, and so the tov is the good, right? That's coming after the noun, right, of the thing being described. So he writes this and he sends it out to all the land. So he writes the letter, the decree, and notice what he says in the decree, that if you're of mixed marriage, if you have one person of one nationality or dialect married to a person of another nationality and dialect, that the language of the household is supposed to be what? The language of the husband. Now, many of us, we're all children of immigrants at some point, right? And in many cultures, when they immigrated to the United States of America, even still to this day, in your household, you spoke the language of your homeland, right? So if you're like a second generation or third generation American, your grandparents spoke the language of their land. So in my paternal grandparents were deceased before I was born, but my maternal grandparents were still alive, and my folk, as they say, are Northern European, German and Swiss, right? That's where we come from, right? And my grandfather still spoke German, right? And my mother would tell me that when they were growing up, he would speak German in the household, right? And so they wanted to keep their customs and their practices. So in this case, the language in a mixed household is going to be the language of the husband. That's the language that's going to be spoken, right, according to the king's edict. All right. So any questions about this so far? No questions. All right. Let me grab a cup of coffee. Drink of coffee, rather. Okay. Now, the king issues the decree. Now, what does that mean for the king? He can't look at his lovely wife anymore. Now, the king's got a harem. He's got concubines. So it's probably not that he's going without any accompaniment, as they would say. But we're going to learn what happens next in chapter 2. So remember, the title of our story is Esther and the King. And so now we're going to learn about Esther. After these things, when the anger of King Cyrus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. So notice that the king is being ruled by this anger that he has about what took place. Now he remembers when the anger starts to calm down, right? So when you get angry, right, you just feel the heat coming up your neck, and you get your face, your cheeks get flushed, right? And then when you start to calm down, what happens? You start to cool off, right? You start to calm down, and he thinks about what he had done. Then the king's young men who had attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the capital, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so." So now notice that because he banished the queen from his presence, there now is not a queen. And so, if a king's going to have offspring, what does he need? He needs a queen, right? He can have offspring other ways, right? But if it's going to be a prince, right, it has to be from a queen. So they're going to select throughout the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia the most beautiful young maidens, virgins. And we all know what that word means. Never been with a man, right? So they're going to gather them together in the harem of the king, and whichever one pleases the king, we'll find out what's entailed in that in a minute, that one is going to be made queen. Okay, this pleased the king, and he did so. Now, there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shemi, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, with whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Let's just stop there for a minute, and we're gonna go back to this board to my left. So Ahasuerus is king of the Medo-Persian Empire. He reigns from 485 to 465 BC. We heard about the great feast that he held in the third year of his reign, which would be 482 BC. And we heard of the decree he issued. But now notice that we just encountered a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, whose name was Mordecai, living where? In the capital city of Susa. Notice the decree was issued in 538 BC. We still have Jews living in the now the Medo-Persian Empire under Artaxerxes as well, so it doesn't come to us as a surprise. But notice that God's people, who have been living in exile in the land of Babylon for almost 70 years, you would think that if you were living in a foreign land under a foreign rule and you were held captive there, if someone said, "Okay, you're free to go," what would you do? I would like to think that you'd run home, right? But notice that the people of God don't. They're still hanging out in the land of exile, in the greater Babylonian, now Medo-Persian Empire, right? But there's a Jew living in the land well, in the capital city, the citadel of Susa. His name is Mordecai, and we're going to find out more about him. But notice it gives his lineage, and it traces it back to where? The tribe of Benjamin, which means that he's a long descendant of who? King Saul, right? Saul was a Benjaminite, right? So King Saul is a Benjaminite. And so he's a descendant of that line. So because of that, he's sort of a descendant of royalty himself, as we'll see. But he's living in the land in the citadel city, capital city of Susa, under Artaxerxes. So he, for whatever reason, and we don't know, from Scripture at least, why is it that he didn't go back? We can't say. Okay? But here's what happens. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. So what does that mean? She's an orphan, right? Her parents are dead. So he's raising her in his own family. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So to help her out, to help one of his fellow people out, when her parents died, he sort of adopted her to be his own. He raised her as his own daughter. But notice how she's described: a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Okay, now that's important. Okay, because you know that the king issued the decree that all the lovely young virgins in the entire kingdom should be brought where? To the king's harem. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. Now, the him there is who? Well, that's the eunuch, right? So the eunuch looked favorably upon Esther. And why? Maybe because she was well-behaved, well-mannered, we don't know. But he showed her his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So notice that the harem is, there's kind of a hierarchy, evidently, in harems, right? There's some parts of the harems that are where the women are better taken care of, and then there's evidently lower parts of the harem. I don't mean structurally speaking, I mean hierarchical, where they're not as well taken care of. So he provided her and her women. So evidently she has women with her who are sort of her attendants, and he provides them with their cosmetics, to make themselves keep up their beauty and whatnot, and their portion of food, right? And he advanced her in the best place, to the best place in the harem. So he watched over her and took care of her. Now, I've never been in a harem, and nor will I ever be in a harem, hopefully, at least not to my foreknowledge anyway. And if I find out I'm in one, I'll leave quickly, right? But notice that it's a place of intrigue. If you need to be watched over, that means what? There's some backbiting and intrigue in the harem, right? Because if you want to be well taken care of, you need to be moving up in the level of the hierarchy. And so he's watching over her and protecting her. He becomes sort of, quote-unquote, her guardian angel in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So what did you just learn? She has not told a single solitary person that she is a Jew. Everybody thinks she's what? Well, a person of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? Her father, her adopted father, if you will, Mordecai, said, don't reveal to anybody what your heritage is. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when her turn came, so her uncle, her adopted father, is still, even though she's in the harem, he's still going by to check on her every day. Now, when Esther's turn came for, and when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in his way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. Just to stop there for a second. Now notice that since we all know biology, okay, so the beautification part is 6 months for the myrrh and 6 months for the spices and ointments. What else would also become apparent after 12 months? If she was really a virgin or not. Because, gestation for human beings is 10 months. Right? We thought she was a virgin, but lo and behold, she's pregnant. Therefore, she's not a virgin. Right? So, there's a twofold part to that. But notice that when it was time for the young woman, singular, when her time came to do what? To go into the king, they would do it in this way. She was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So she could, when she was summoned to come into the king's, in the presence of the king. Now we're going to find out what that means. I think we all know what that means if you're a part of a harem, right? But in the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem. Now notice there's a first harem and a second harem. The first harem is the virgins. The second harem would be any woman who's then had relations with the king, right? In the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So now notice the practice, not to get too graphic, right? But the young virgin, when it was her turn, she would go into the king and spend the night in the king's room, right? They would have relations with one another, and then in the morning, and she could take whatever it was that she wanted to take with her, to please the king. Now notice that you know from the text that these young women, once they spent their night with the king, they would go into the second harem where the concubines were, and they would never again come into the presence of the king unless what? Unless the king called them by name. So this young woman has to really, really, really please the king in order to come into his presence ever again. Okay, just something to keep in mind. So, this is the normal practice. Now, for an Israelite woman, for a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are you supposed to give yourself to? Your husband and your husband alone. Right? Now, they're not supposed to, and back in the day, you remember when Rebekah came back from the land of Haran and Isaac saw her from afar? You remember that they went to the justice of the peace that very afternoon, right? They did. There was no justice of the peace, right? Where did they go? They went into the tent of his mother. They became one flesh, and they were married. No ceremony, no big feast or anything. But when you know a person in the biblical way, you become married to them. And so this practice for Esther should be, we would understand it to be an abomination, right? Because the daughters of the house of Israel are not to be given to the sons of the nations, nor are the sons of the Israelites supposed to take daughters for their wives from the nations, right? So this practice should be an abomination, and this might also clue us into why Mordecai was going every day to check on his adopted daughter, right? When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. So notice that Esther relies on whom? the one guy who probably knows the king's preferences, right? And whatever he advised her to do, that's what she was going to do. So this guardian angel, quote unquote, who has been watching over her, is now going to tell her exactly what to do. And now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So now we get another historical reference, right? 7 years into his reign. This is a period of time after the great feast. 4 years after the great feast. He's now going to replace his queen. It's been a while since he's had a queen. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and his servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So now Esther is made queen, right? So what does that mean? Well, she's married to Xerxes or King Ahasuerus. Right? He found great delight in her, and you remember what the decree was, that the one who found great delight will be the queen that replaces Vashti. So he places the royal crown. We don't know what transpired. We don't need to know what transpired. What we see is the end product, that he places the royal crown on Esther's head, and now she becomes queen of the Medo-Persian Empire. And what did he do? Evidently, she pleased him a lot because he gave a feast in her honor for his officials and his servants. And he also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now, out of honor for his new queen, he gives everybody in the land a tax break. We don't know how much. But he also then gave gifts with royal generosity. So he was so pleased by Esther that he has this overwhelming urge or desire to let the people benefit. All right. Okay. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Okay, let's just stop there for a minute. So two of the king's eunuchs, and eunuchs these are some of the most trusted people, not the most trusted, but some of the king's most trusted people, because why? They're watching over all of his women, right? And what do they decide to do? They're going to lead a revolt against King Ahasuerus, Xerxes. And it becomes known to Mordecai. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, the Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and literally I believe that could be translated as on spikes. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So notice that Mordecai is, even though that Esther is now the queen of the land, he still comes and does what? He checks up on her. This girl that he raised to be like his own daughter, he comes and he checks up on her. And while he's hanging out in the gate of the city of the king's palace, he overhears the intrigue and the plot. And so what does Mordecai do? He tells his adopted daughter, so-and-so and so-and-so, the king's eunuchs, are plotting to kill the king. Go warn your husband. So she does. She goes to her husband, the king, and she tells him, and notice the text tells us what? The text tells us that Esther doesn't take credit for the report that she's giving. She gives the credit to whom? Mordecai. And this will become important, really important for next week's lesson, the second part of the book of Esther. So what does the king do? So notice that the king just doesn't take the word of his queen. He does what? He investigates. Before you ever put someone to death, you should investigate, right? Before you make a decision. Make sure it's true or not. And so the king investigates. And it comes to pass that what? It is, as Mordecai reported, that they were plotting a revolt and a rebellion to do in the king. And so the king then hangs them on the gallows on spikes. And many of you know my references to movies. And this bears witness to an event that's going to happen that we're going to observe on Friday. Right? Oftentimes when people are put on spikes, so I'll start with the movie reference. In the Pirates of the Caribbean, when Jack Sparrow is coming in on his little dinghy into the port, right, which is partially sinking, as he's coming in, there's 3 people hanging from ropes over on his left. And the bodies are in different states of decay. And the reason that they're in different states of decay is they were left there as a warning to this is what we do to pirates in this place. We hang them. So if you're a pirate, maybe don't come here. Now, this was the practice at the time of our story for today as well. Notice the king hangs them on gallows, puts them on spikes for everybody to see what? This is what we do to people who plot against the king. This was the practice at the time of the Romans as well. They would often leave bodies on the crosses where they were crucified because only the worst of the worst criminals were crucified. Right? That punishment was reserved for the worst of the worst of the worst. Right? And they would let the bodies hang on the cross and let the birds eat the carrion. Right? Now, on Good Friday, as we're going to hear, as you well know, well, if you were with us on Wednesday, you heard, right? Joseph of Arimathea goes and asks for the body of Jesus, right? Because under Mosaic law, even a cursed man, and any man hanged on a tree was a cursed man. Any cursed man deserves a proper burial before sundown. So Pilate releases the body. Right? And Jesus is buried in the tomb. But this practice has existed sort of throughout time at different places. And it's designed as a warning to those that would do these kinds of things, whatever things that person did, right? This is how we treat those people. So the plot is to kill King Ahasuerus. He discovers the plot after being notified by Mordecai through Queen Esther, and he investigates the affair. He finds it to be true, and then both men were hanged. And notice, as it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So the king, his scribe, his secretary, writes down this event. Right? So how many of you keep a diary, or for guys, a journal? Anybody? Not in a long time. Not since I was a little kid, Pastor. Right? Girls, ladies. Right? But so in your journal or your diary, what would you normally do? Well, you'd put the date, right? And then you'd write down what happened on that day, right? What was so important, or what special events, or whatever the case might be. You know, so guys, you remember the day you proposed to your wife, right? Hopefully you do, right? And don't forget your anniversary, just as a forewarning, and her birthday. Mother's Day, Christmas, all those, Valentine's Day, all those good holidays. Remember those holidays. Keeps you in good standing, right? Because you need it. I need it, right? To be in good standing with my lovely wife. But I jest. So the king, though, in the official court transcripts of the king, he writes down, on this date, this is what happened, and this is who notified, this is how I came to find out about this, right? Was through Queen Esther and Mordecai. And that becomes really important for next week's lesson. So, but now, next week when we come back, we're going to come up sort of Esther Part 2, if you will. I can't remember the title of next week's lesson. Oh, sorry, time out. No class next week. Because we're going to resume our Easter potluck breakfast. It's been over 2 years since we had one. And hopefully everybody received the robo-call, the robo-pastor call, as some of you call it, my voice message that went out. And the aforementioned sign-up sheet is right over there on the glass wall, right above the shepherd's visit list, a visitation schedule, right behind the organ. So if you want to sign up and help bring some items, we sort of identified what we'd like. We've pared it back. Hopefully we didn't pare back too much. We were trying to figure out just sort of quantity-wise how much food to bring. Hopefully no one will go away hungry. I'm sure you won't. But that's going to be next week from 9 to 10 right here in this room. We'll have everything arranged for our sort of maximum seating, and we'll have a fellowship event to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So no class next week, and that, for those of you who are with us via our YouTube channel, so you get the week off. We're not going to broadcast the fellowship meal. Sorry, we don't want to see. We don't want to let you see what you're missing out on by not being in person with us. But hopefully you'll be able to join us the following week. So that will be the 24th. Our next adult Bible study class is going to be April 24th. Okay, so we'll stop there this week. There's coffee and it looks like some muffins still in the back, so you can enjoy that. And we'd like to thank those that joined us via our YouTube channel. We hope to see you again on the 24th for our next adult Bible study class of Esther Part 2. That's not the formal title, but it's as best as I'm going to come up with on the spur of the moment. All right, we'll stop there. Have a blessed week. Don't forget, our worship service is at 10:15.